In the autumn of 1981, a name appeared on a football shirt that had never appeared on anything before. West Bromwich Albion, First Division, the Hawthorns. 60,000 people watching on a Saturday afternoon. And there it was. 3 letters, printed across the chest of every player on the pitch. BSR, a name that meant nothing to most of the people in that ground. A name that had meant nothing to most of the people in Britain for nearly 50 years. And yet, that name, those 3 letters, had been inside the machine that sat in the corner of almost every British teenager's bedroom since the early 1950s. It had been inside the device on which a generation heard Elvis Presley for the first time, on which they heard Lonnie Donegan, Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard, the Beatles. It had been inside over 1 million record players sold across Britain in 2 decades. It had been inside the consoles and radiograms of living rooms from Liverpool to London, from Newcastle to Bristol. It had powered approximately 87% of every auto-changer mechanism sold to record player manufacturers across the entire world. 87%. The factories that built it employed thousands of people in the Black Country. In Cradley Heath and Old Hill, in the industrial heartland of the West Midlands. Those people built precision mechanisms that ended up inside products bearing other companies' names, sold in other companies' shops, in other companies' packaging, on 5 continents. By the time that name finally appeared somewhere, the British public could see it. Printed on a football shirt, on a Saturday afternoon in the autumn of 1981, the factories were already closing. The workers were already gone. The Waterfall Lane site in Cradley Heath had shut its gates 14 months earlier. 2,300 people had collected their final wages and walked out into a Black Country that would not replace what it had lost. The name was finally visible. There was nothing left to buy. How does a company spend 40 years making the engine of British music culture and never once put its name on the machine? If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of the British makers who built the sounds that defined an era, and what happened when those sounds stopped being made in Britain. Subscribe if that's the kind of story that keeps you up at night. It keeps me up too. Now, back to the Black Country. The Black Country is not Birmingham. This is not a minor geographical distinction. It is a matter of identity, of industrial lineage, of a working culture that predates the city to its east by centuries. The Black Country, the area of Staffordshire and Worcestershire that takes its name from the coal seams that blackened its skies and the ironworks that turned its nights orange, made things. Chain, anchor, nail, glass. The skills that built Britain's industrial infrastructure came from these towns: Dudley, Wolverhampton, Cradley Heath, Old Hill. The people who lived there were metal workers before they were anything else. Precision was not a professional aspiration. It was a neighborhood standard. It was into this world that Daniel MacLean MacDonald arrived, sometime around 1930, with an engineering education from Glasgow University and a period of employment at British Thomson Houston in Rugby behind him. BTH was one of the great British electrical engineering firms, a company that had built transformers, motors, and amplifiers for the BBC and for British industry since the late 19th century. MacDonald had learned there how to make electrical signals do what you needed them to do. He had learned tolerance. He had learned that the difference between a component that worked and a component that merely appeared to work was measured in fractions of a millimeter. He started independently from a small rented workshop in Blackheath, a few miles from Old Hill, the same Black Country grain, and formalized the venture in October 1932. Initial capital, 25,100. The company's name, Birmingham Sound Reproducers. The company was not in Birmingham. It would never be in Birmingham. The factories would spend their entire existence in Old Hill and Cradley Heath, towns that were technically in Staffordshire or Worcestershire, depending on which administrative reckoning applied, and were never, under any reckoning, in Birmingham. People who worked there were clear on this point. One former employee, recalling the company decades later, put it without ceremony. Calling BSR a Birmingham company would probably have caused a riot. McDonald chose the name for its associations. Birmingham meant engineering. Birmingham meant precision manufacture. Birmingham meant a supply chain of skilled metalworkers and component makers who understood what tolerance meant at scale. The name was aspirational geography, a claim on a tradition rather than a postcode. And it worked. Nobody outside the Black Country looked too closely at the address. By 1947, BSR was manufacturing communication sets, laboratory test equipment, sound recording instruments, and a nascent range of gramophone equipment. The company had survived the war producing equipment for British industry and government, and emerged from it with a workforce that understood precision assembly, and a founder who understood that the post-war British household was about to acquire an appetite for something it had not previously been able to afford. The long-playing record arrived in Britain in 1948. The 7-inch single arrived in 1950. Within 3 years, the British market for home audio was transforming from a luxury niche into a mass consumer proposition. Records were affordable. The question was, what would people play them on? The gramophone was a piece of furniture. The radiogram, a combined radio and record player in a wooden cabinet, was a serious investment, purchased once and expected to last. Neither was portable. Neither was available at a price that a working family in the early 1950s could access without significant deliberation. The auto-changer mechanism, a device that could stack multiple records on a spindle, drop them one by one onto a rotating platter, play each in sequence, and lift the arm clear at the end, had existed in various forms since the 1930s. But it was heavy, expensive to manufacture with precision, and required engineering tolerances that made mass production difficult at a price point that mattered. McDonald's company had been working on record-changing mechanisms since the late 1940s. By the early 1950s, BSR was producing auto-changer units that combined reliability with a manufacturing cost low enough to make them viable as a component inside a machine that a working family might actually buy. In the early 1950s, a London businessman named Samuel Margolin, trading as J&A Margolin Limited, approached BSR. Margolin had an idea. He wanted to put the BSR auto-changer mechanism inside a portable case, add a speaker to the lid, make it available in colors, red, cream, turquoise, and sell it to the new class of consumer the British economy was producing. The teenager, with a weekly wage packet and a hunger for records that the radio was no longer sufficient to satisfy. Margolin called it the Dansette. What does it mean to build the most important machine in British music and make sure almost nobody knows your name? In the summer of 1959, a woman named Mona Best purchased a record player for a coffee club she was running in the basement of her house in West Derby, Liverpool. The club was called the Casbah. The record player was a Dansette. It was mounted on the wall. It played records between the live sets performed by the young bands who used the Casbah as a rehearsal space and an early venue in the months before they found their way to Hamburg and to history. One of those bands was the Beatles. The mechanism inside that Dansette, the component that dropped the record onto the platter, held the speed steady, tracked the groove, and lifted the arm clear at the end of each side, was built in Cradley Heath. The name on the player was Dansette. The name on the mechanism was BSR. The teenagers in the basement of Mona Best's house in Liverpool heard neither name. They heard the music. This is what BSR's dominance looked like from the ground. Not a corporate achievement, not a market share statistic, a turntable mechanism in a coffee club basement in Liverpool in 1959, playing the records that a generation of British musicians were absorbing, dissecting, and reimagining into something that would shortly be exported back to America under the name British Invasion. The sound that came out of that Dansette speaker, the fidelity, the frequency response, the tracking stability that kept the stylus in the groove through an evening of dancing, was a function of Black Country engineering. The Dansette's promotional literature, in later years, would claim that many of the songwriters who defined British popular music, including, by name, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, produced their work from listening to records on their dansettes. This is company promotional material rather than documented testimony and should be treated accordingly. What is documented is the Casbah dansette. What is documented is the 1 million dansette players sold across Britain in 2 decades, every one of them running a BSR mechanism. What is documented is that the portable record player, affordable, colorful, available in furniture shops, was the primary means by which the first generation of British rock and roll listeners heard the American records they would transform into British popular music. BSR did not make rock and roll. BSR made the machine that played the records that made the people who made rock and roll. When every teenager in Britain was hearing the future of music, who made the machine that played it? The scale of BSR's reach extended well beyond the British market. By the early 1960s, the company's auto-changer mechanisms were inside record players sold across North America, across continental Europe, and across the developing markets of Asia and South America. American console stereo manufacturers, the companies producing the large wooden cabinets that dominated middle-class American living rooms in the early 1960s, sourced BSR mechanisms because the alternative was to develop their own, at a cost that could not be justified when a reliable British component was available at a price that made the arithmetic work. The OEM relationship, replicated across dozens of manufacturers in a dozen countries, produced a production demand that BSR's Black Country factories were structured to meet. The factories in Old Hill and Cradley Heath operated at a scale that had no equivalent in British consumer electronics. Shift patterns ran through the night. The precision assembly lines, the jigging, the adjustment, the testing of each mechanism before it left the factory required a workforce that had absorbed the Black Country's metalworking tradition and applied it to a new kind of precision object. By 1977, those factories were producing over 250,000 units per week. Read that number again. 250,000 auto-changer mechanisms every week, from 2 towns in the West Midlands that the rest of Britain thought of, vaguely, as part of Birmingham. By one account, approximately 90% of that production was destined for export. In the domestic British market, the dansettes, the radiograms, the bookshelf stereo systems absorbed the remainder. The world was running on Black Country engineering, and the Black Country was, by the standards of British manufacturing in the 1970s, doing well. The factories were full. The order books were committed. The company had gone public in 1957, had grown steadily through the 1960s, and had, by the mid-1970s, reached a scale that placed it among the most significant British manufacturers of consumer electronics components in the world. The name on the mechanism, as always, was not the name on the product. BSR McDonald, stamped on the underside of the deck, printed on the component documentation, known to the buyers at every major record player manufacturer in the world, remained invisible to the consumer who dropped a record onto the spindle and pressed the lever and heard the music start. That invisibility had been BSR's greatest commercial asset. It had allowed the company to supply competitors simultaneously, to work across brands without loyalty complications, to price its mechanisms as engineering rather than as brand equity. The buyer of a dansette and the buyer of an American console stereo and the buyer of a Danish radiogram were all, without knowing it, buying the same Black Country precision. They were buying the same tolerances, the same materials, the same assembly standards that had been established in a workshop in Old Hill in 1932 with £2,500 of initial capital. For 25 years, that had been enough. In 1975, BSR did something unexpected. The company that had spent 25 years making mechanisms that disappeared inside other people's products decided to make a product of its own, one that would carry its name on the outside. that would sit in the window of a hi-fi shop, rather than hidden beneath a chassis, that would compete not in the mass-market auto-changer segment it had dominated for 2 decades, but in the upmarket territory occupied by Garrard and Thorens and the serious British audiophile brands. The result was the AcuTrack 4000, and its marketing material announced it with a line that no auto-changer manufacturer had ever used before or needed to. Its father was a turntable, its mother was a computer. The AcuTrack 4000 was built at BSR's Garrett's Lane factory in Cradley Heath, with electronics developed in collaboration with Pico Electronics. It was a direct-drive turntable, the platter driven directly by the motor beneath it, rather than via a belt, eliminating the speed variations introduced by belt wear and compliance. It incorporated an optical sensor system that read the surface of a vinyl record, detecting the gaps between tracks by measuring the difference in reflectivity between the playing surface and the silence between bands. Using this information, the machine's memory bank could be programmed to play tracks in any order the listener specified. This was 1975. The compact disc was 7 years away. The digital playlist was further away still. The idea that a mechanical device could read a record surface, locate specific tracks, and play them in a sequence chosen by the listener before the record was placed on the platter was, in the mid-1970s, genuinely novel. The AcuTrack 4000 came with a wireless remote control, a device that, in 1975, was encountered in almost no domestic audio equipment anywhere in the world. It could store up to 24 track selections with programmable repeat functionality. The company's own demonstration record, pressed specifically to show the machine's capabilities and sent to retailers and reviewers, was titled, "Seeing is Believing." It was, in its way, a remarkable object, a machine built by the world's largest auto-changer manufacturer, a company whose entire commercial history had been defined by making mechanisms that worked reliably at volume and at price, had produced something that looked, in 1975, like a glimpse of how music would be listened to in a future that had not yet arrived. The engineering ambition was real. The manufacturing capability to produce it was demonstrably present. The Cradley Heath factory that built it had spent 2 decades building precision into objects that cost a fraction of what the AcuTrack 4000 commanded. The machine sold. It did not sell in the volumes that BSR's OEM business had accustomed the company to measuring. It attracted collectors and enthusiasts. It was reviewed with interest in the audio press. A later model, the AcuTrack 3500, extended the concept to handle a stack of up to 6 singles or long players, combining the auto-changer heritage with the programmable playback innovation. Today, surviving examples of the AcuTrack 4000 are sought by collectors precisely because they represent the moment a mass-production engineering giant briefly revealed what it might have become if the market had moved in a different direction. It did not move in that direction. While BSR was building the AcuTrack 4000 at Garrett's Lane, the company's leadership was pursuing a parallel strategy that had nothing to do with audio. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, BSR had been acquiring British housewares companies. In 1971, the company purchased Bullpit & Sons, a Birmingham firm whose brands included Goblin, makers of vacuum cleaners and domestic cleaning equipment, and Swan, a long-established name in British electrical appliances, including kettles and irons. These were solid, unglamorous, functional British consumer brands with established retail relationships and steady demand. The logic was not unreasonable. BSR's core business, auto-changer mechanisms, was a component business, dependent on OEM customers who could, in principle, source from elsewhere if the price or the specification changed. A housewares business, selling directly to consumers under established brand names, offered a different kind of commercial stability. It was a hedge. It was also a signal, though nobody described it as such at the time, that the company's leadership understood, at some level, that the auto-changer mechanism had a finite future. The world that had needed BSR's core product since the early 1950s was not going to need it in quite the same way forever. The LP record would not spin on auto-changer mechanisms indefinitely. Something else was coming. Daniel MacDonald had, by this point, stepped back from operational control of the company he had founded. The public offering of 1957 and the subsequent growth of the 1960s had brought in a board and a management structure that reflected the company's scale, and that was prepared to make strategic bets that a founder in his 70s, however gifted an engineer, might have resisted the housewares acquisitions preceded. The Accutrack 4000 was built and launched. The OEM order books remained committed. In the Birmingham History Forum, decades later, a man who remembered buying his first proper hi-fi system would write, "BSR deck and Wharfdale speakers, class acts." He had known the difference. He had known that a BSR deck was a step up from the dansette he had grown up with. He had played Fairport Convention's Liege and Leaf, loud on it, and been satisfied. He had not known particularly what BSR was or where it came from. He had known what it sounded like. That was the relationship BSR had always had with the people it served. Not recognition, not loyalty to a name, simply the unremarked experience of a mechanism doing what a mechanism was supposed to do, dropping the record, holding the speed, tracking the groove, while the music played and the name remained, as it had always remained, out of sight. The order books were full. The factories were running. The Accutrack 4000 was in the shop window, and the world was about to change in a way that no auto-changer mechanism, however precisely engineered, could accommodate. The shift did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a set of simultaneous pressures, commercial, technological, structural, that converged on BSR's Black Country factories across the second half of the 1970s with a speed that the order books of 1977 had given no reason to anticipate. The first pressure was the one BSR had always understood best: engineering. Specifically, other people's engineering. Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, BSR's OEM customers, the American console makers, the European radiogram producers, the Japanese electronics assemblers, had sourced their auto-changer mechanisms from Cradley Heath because the alternative was to develop their own. BSR's precision manufacturing capability, built over 2 decades at a scale no single customer could replicate internally, made the economics straightforward. It was cheaper, faster, and more reliable to buy from BSR than to build the capability independently. By the mid-1970s, that calculation had changed. The Japanese electronics industry, Matsushita, Pioneer, Sony, Hitachi, had spent the previous decade developing manufacturing capabilities of their own that were, by any honest assessment, competitive with BSR's. The direct drive motor, pioneered by Matsushita's Technics division in 1969 with the SP-10, had demonstrated that a different approach to turntable engineering, one that did not rely on the auto-changer mechanism at all, could produce superior speed stability and reduced mechanical noise. The serious listener, by the mid-1970s, was being offered a choice between BSR's auto-changer heritage and a belt drive or direct drive turntable from a Japanese manufacturer that asked the listener to place a single record at a time on the platter and give it their full attention. The audiophile market, small in absolute terms but significant as a signal, moved toward the Japanese single-play turntable. The mass market was, for the moment, still buying auto-changer-equipped systems. But the OEM customers who had sustained BSR's order books were reconsidering. Japanese electronics assemblers, in particular, were finding it more economical to develop their own mechanisms or to source from within the Japanese supply chain than to continue importing from the Black Country. The verticalization of Japanese consumer electronics manufacturing, the process by which Japanese companies brought more and more of their component supply in-house or within national borders, was not directed at BSR specifically. It did not need to be. Its effect on BSR's order books was the same regardless of intent. The second pressure was consumer behavior. And it came from Japan as well, though from a different direction. Sony launched the Walkman in Britain in 1980. The Walkman was a cassette player. It weighed 390 grams. It fitted in a jacket pocket. It played music through lightweight headphones while the listener walked, ran, cycled, or sat on a bus. It required no turntable. It required no auto changer. It required no fixed location, no power outlet, no surface flat enough to keep a stylus in a groove. It required only a pre-recorded cassette and a pair of AA batteries. The Walkman did not kill the record player overnight, but it announced, with the kind of clarity that only a commercially successful product can achieve, that the relationship between recorded music and physical location was about to be severed permanently. The teenager who had needed a dansette in a bedroom to hear music privately in 1959 needed, in 1980, only a Walkman and a pair of headphones. The auto-changer mechanism, the component that had made private music listening accessible to a generation, was not needed for this new kind of listening at all. BSR had produced reel-to-reel tape decks alongside its turntable mechanisms for years. It had not moved into the cassette market at a scale that would have positioned it to compete in the world the Walkman was creating. The company's identity, its engineering culture, its manufacturing infrastructure, its commercial relationships, was built around the auto-changer. Pivoting from that position, at the scale BSR operated, would have required decisions and investments that the evidence suggests were not made, or were not made quickly enough. The order books, which had been the company's measure of health for 3 decades, began to contract. The response was not slow, it was simply insufficient. In June 1980, the Waterfall Lane site in Cradley Heath closed. 2,300 workers were made redundant. The announcement was noted in the local press. In the national press, it was one factory closure among many in a year that was producing factory closures at a rate Britain had not seen since the 1930s. The Thatcher government's first year in office had coincided with a severe recession. Manufacturing across the Midlands and the North was contracting at speed. BSR's closure was absorbed into a larger story of British industrial retreat that made individual tragedies harder to see clearly. In February 1981, a further 1,200 jobs were shed at the remaining Cradley Heath facility. And in that same autumn, the autumn of 1981, BSR's name appeared on a West Bromwich Albion football shirt for the first time. The company that had spent 49 years making sure its name was never visible had chosen this moment, when the Waterfall Lane gates were already locked, when the redundancy notices had already been issued, when the order books were running at a fraction of their 1977 levels, to seek public recognition. The logo appeared on the chest of every West Brom player in the first division that season. It appeared during their UEFA Cup campaign. It was seen by millions of people who had no idea what BSR was, or had been, or was ceasing to be. What does it mean when the most successful British manufacturer nobody had heard of finally put its name somewhere people could see it, just as there was nothing left to buy? The Black Country had no answer to that question. The factories were answering it in their own way, with locked gates and empty car parks, and the particular silence of a production line that has stopped. In 1983, the Pauk Lane facility in Old Hill closed. 1,100 more workers, the precision assemblers, the line engineers, the quality checkers, who had spent careers learning the tolerances of a mechanism that the world had needed and was needing less with every passing quarter. They collected their final wages and walked out of a factory that had been part of the Black Country's working landscape for decades. Across all of BSR's divisions, the workforce shed over the 5 years from 1980 approached, by one account, 10,000 positions. 10,000 people in 2 small Black Country towns whose industrial identity had been built, in significant part, around what had happened inside those factory gates. The craft knowledge that left with them did not go anywhere. It dispersed. The precision assembly of auto-changer mechanisms, the understanding of how a mechanical arm should descend, at what angle, at what speed, with what force, to place a stylus in a groove without damaging the vinyl, was not a skill that transferred cleanly to another industry. It was specific. It had been developed over decades, passed between workers in the same factory, refined through the accumulated experience of a workforce that had been doing the same thing, to an increasingly high standard since the late 1940s. When the factories closed, that knowledge went with the workers into retirement, into retraining, into other industries that did not need what they knew. It was not recorded. It was not archived. It simply ended. BSR's management, meanwhile, was attempting to navigate the company toward a future that did not depend on the auto-changer. The houseware strategy, Goblin, Swan, had provided revenues that partially offset the decline in audio. But these were not growth businesses. They were steady, mature, British consumer brands operating in markets that were themselves under pressure from cheaper imported goods. The same dynamics that had eroded BSR's OEM auto-changer business were working, at a slower pace, on the vacuum cleaner and the electric kettle. The pivot that best captures what BSR had become by the early 1980s was not the housewares acquisition. It was the Wafa drive. In 1984, BSR manufactured a product called the Rotronics Wafa drive, a data storage peripheral for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum home computer. The Wafa drive used a small proprietary tape cartridge to store and retrieve programs written in BASIC. It was designed to be faster and more reliable than the standard cassette recorder that most ZX Spectrum owners used for the same purpose. It was sold through the same retail channels that were, at the same moment, selling the ZX Spectrum itself to a generation of British schoolchildren who were learning to program. Consider what this means. The company that had built the mechanism inside the Dansette, on which a generation of British teenagers heard the Beatles for the first time, was, in 1984, building a device that stored basic programs for home computers. The company that had held 87% of the world's auto-changer market was manufacturing a data cassette drive for the ZX Spectrum. The factories in the Black Country that had run 3 shifts producing 250,000 turntable mechanisms per week in 1977 were, 7 years later, making a peripheral for a home computer that cost $99.95 at W.H. Smith. The Wafa drive was not a failure of imagination. It was a symptom of a company that had lost the commercial foundation that defined it, and was searching, with the resources it had left, for something that would replace it. The search was not successful. In 1984, Goblin was sold to the American company Shop Vac. The vacuum cleaner brand that had been part of BSR for 13 years left the company for the United States, carrying with it a portion of the housewares revenue that had cushioned the audio decline. In 1985, BSR produced its last turntable, the last one. No ceremony marked it, no final production run announcement in the trade press, no photograph of the last mechanism leaving the Garrett's Lane factory. The production simply stopped because the orders had stopped, because the world had found other ways to play its music and other companies to make the machines that played it. The auto-changer mechanism, the device that had powered the British Dansette and the American console stereo and the Danish radiogram and the Japanese bookshelf system for 3 decades, ceased to be made in the Black Country after 1985. The Aztec Power Supply division was retained. Power supplies, the component that converts mains electricity into the voltage a circuit requires. Unglamorous, essential, invisible inside every piece of electronic equipment that requires power. BSR had begun in 1932 making transformers and amplifiers for sound. It ended, in its British form, making power supplies for electronic equipment that made no sound at all. In 1988, Swan was sold to Moulinex of France. In 1989, Emerson Electric of the United States took a 45% stake in the restructured company. The name changed to Aztec, BSR, plc. The headquarters relocated to Hong Kong. The Black Country address, Old Hill, Cradley Heath, the two towns that had housed the factories, was no longer relevant. The company that had called itself Birmingham Sound Reproducers for 57 years was, by 1989, a Hong Kong registered power supply business with an American majority shareholder, and a name that no longer mentioned Birmingham or sound or reproduction. In 1998, Emerson Electric acquired the remainder. It was gone. The gates at Waterfall Lane were locked. The Pauk Lane site was cleared. The Garrett's Lane factory, where the Accutrack 4000 had been built with its optical sensors and its wireless remote, and its promise of a programmable future, was repurposed. The land found other uses. The Black Country found, with difficulty, other industries. The BSR name survived. It appeared, in subsequent years, on budget consumer electronics, amplifiers, record players, audio equipment of various kinds, manufactured in Asia and sold through discount retailers. The engineering lineage of Old Hill and Cradley Heath was not present in these products. The tolerance standards that had given BSR its 87% market share were not present. The name was present. The name was a trademark. A trademark, unlike a factory, does not require skilled labor to maintain. The machines sold under the BSR name today bear no more relationship to the mechanisms built in the Black Country than a postcard of a cathedral bears to the stone and the craft that raised it. The collectors who seek original BSR mechanism dansets, and the audio enthusiasts who restore surviving Accutrack 4000 units, understand this distinction without needing it explained. The secondary market has already rendered its verdict. The original is what it is. The name that survived it is something else entirely. What stands today at Waterfall Lane in Cradley Heath is not a factory. The site that employed 2,300 people, that ran precision assembly lines through the night, that produced auto-changer mechanisms to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, that supplied the component at the heart of the machine, that played the records that defined British youth culture for 2 decades, has been cleared and repurposed in the way that Black Country industrial land is repurposed when the industry that justified it is gone. The streets around it still carry the geography of a manufacturing community. The tight terraced housing, the pubs on corner plots, the social infrastructure of a place built around shift patterns and factory gates. The factory itself is absent. What replaced it is quieter, lower, less certain of its purpose. The Garrett's Lane site in Cradley Heath, where the Accutrack 4000 was assembled with its optical sensors and its wireless remote and its programming memory and its conviction that the future of music playback would be chosen in advance by the listener. That site, too, has passed into other uses. The machinery is long gone. The jigging tools and the assembly fixtures and the testing rigs that verified each mechanism before it left the factory, scrapped or dispersed decades ago. The dansette, meanwhile, has become one of the most collectible domestic objects of the British 1950s and 1960s. Restored examples in good condition, the two-tone models from the late 1950s particularly, the ones in red and cream, the ones that look precisely like the object a British teenager in 1959 would have saved for over several months and carried home from a furniture shop with a specific kind of satisfaction, sell for up to £500. The collector market for dansettes is driven more by cosmetic condition than by model specification, though a machine with a functioning BSR mechanism in good order commands a premium over one that has been re-equipped with a replacement deck. The original mechanism is the point. It is what the object was. The Accutrack 4000 occupies a different place in the collector consciousness. Less nostalgia, more fascination. It surfaces at auction and on specialist audio platforms at prices that reflect its curiosity value rather than its sonic performance. somewhere between $75 and $200 in recent American sales, occasionally more for an example with its original remote receiver and demonstration record intact. The demonstration record, pressed by BSR specifically to show the machine's track selection capabilities, titled "Seeing is Believing," is itself a collector's item, a piece of promotional vinyl that documents a moment when a mass-production engineering company briefly imagined a different future for itself and pressed the evidence into 12 inches of vinyl. The BSR name, as noted, survived. It appears today on consumer audio products with no connection to the engineering lineage of Old Hill and Cradley Heath. This is the hollow revival in its most complete form. Not a relaunch, not a reissue, not an attempt to recreate what existed. Simply the continued commercial use of a trademark by entities with no relationship to the original company, the original workforce, or the original manufacturing standards. The collector market has already rendered its verdict on this arrangement. Nobody seeking an original BSR mechanism specifies a budget product bearing the BSR name. The name, in the collector's vocabulary, refers exclusively to what was made in the Black Country before 1985. What came after is a different thing that happens to use the same letters. And then there is the surprise. Daniel McLean MacDonald, the Glasgow-trained engineer who had started BSR in October 1932 with £2,500 of initial capital in a rented workshop in Blackheath, who had built the Black Country's most significant consumer electronics manufacturer, who had taken the company public in 1957 and watched it grow to 87% of the world's auto changer market, who had stepped back from operational control as the company diversified into housewares and power supplies and the making of data cassette drives for home computers, died in 1991. He left to Cambridge University, an endowment of approximately £11 million. The endowment was used to create the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, a center dedicated to the study of what human civilizations leave behind, material culture, physical evidence, the objects that survive when the people who made them are gone, and from which later generations attempt to reconstruct what those people knew, what they valued, and how they lived. It was said to be one of the largest endowments Cambridge had ever received. The man who built the mechanism of British music culture, who made the invisible component inside the machine that played the records that shaped a generation, chose, at the end of his life, to fund the discipline concerned with what civilizations leave behind when they are gone. He did not endow a music department. He did not fund audio engineering. He did not establish a prize for British manufacturing or a scholarship for Black Country engineers. He funded archaeology, the study of traces, the study of the gap between what existed and what remains. It is tempting to read this as a statement. It is more honest to read it as a fact and allow the fact to carry its own weight. What does it mean to build the sound of a generation and leave no name on it at all? Perhaps it means that the name was never the point. The point was the mechanism. The point was the precision. The point was the record dropping onto the platter in a coffee club basement in Liverpool in 1959, the stylus finding the groove, the music starting, and a room full of young people hearing something that would not leave them. The name on the machine was Dansette. The name on the mechanism was BSR MacDonald, stamped on the underside where nobody looked. The name on the institute that studies what civilizations leave behind is MacDonald, somewhere in the Black Country, in a house in Cradley Heath or Old Hill, in a back bedroom or a front room, in the possession of someone who inherited it or found it in a charity shop or paid £50 for it at a car boot sale in the West Midlands on a Sunday morning. There is almost certainly a Dansette still in working order. It is cream and red, or turquoise, or the particular shade of gray that the early 1960s models used. The lid opens at the top. The speaker is mounted inside it. The mechanism inside it, the auto changer, the spindle, the arm, the motor, was built in Cradley Heath to tolerances established by a Glasgow-trained engineer with 2,500 pounds and a conviction that precision mattered. Put a record on the spindle, press the lever, the arm descends, the stylus finds the groove. The name that made it possible is nowhere to be seen. See you in the next one.